have a very simple lesson this morning. Pat was reading something on Facebook, and she came up and saw a little post, and it either said God in a word or God in one word. It got me to thinking. And so I got to looking in the New Testament, and I found that there are several times that there are writers who used one word in a description of God. But then I realized something else. When you stop and you think about that, you might ask why. Why did they use the word they used? Well, you know, there are a lot of things in this world that are good for a lot of things. It's kind of interesting to think about vinegar. You know, vinegar's been around a long, long, long time. And in the days before all the modern chemical cleaners that we have and medicines that we have, vinegar was a very valuable part of a household. Just think of all the things you did with it, and all the things it could do, and all the things it still can. And I'm still not sure that the best window washing solution is still not putting a little vinegar in water. It may be the best there is, despite all the Windex and other products that are out there. And it does a lot of things. So it's not just one thing, it's many things. And it's kind of that way with God. They do use one word in the description of God, but sometimes it's because it's kind of like when you're talking about God, if you say, what can answer my needs? You know what the answer would be? God. But there would be different things that would be your needs. And so when God answers those needs, that would be a different word to describe in that particular circumstance what God meant to you and what God has done for you. And so I began to read, and what I tried to do was to select passages in which it was written in a very express way. And so I just wanted to use this expression, God is, and let the other word fill in the blank, if you please, as to what God is. And as I began to read, I began to realize that there are a lot of passages that say God is, and it gives you a word to tell you what God is. First thing that's interesting is, and it's in Mark chapter 12. And I think this is interesting for a reason, and let me kind of point it out to you. In Mark chapter 12, there is a conversation that we've read many times, but seldom ever in the book of Mark, for whatever reason. We read of this conversation most often in Matthew, and once in a while somebody might read the conversation from the book of Luke. But seldom, if ever, do we read this conversation from the book of Mark. This conversation is a conversation that existed between Jesus and the scribes. And it has a question. And the question is, which is the first commandment of all? Now, generally, you would say, love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, mind, and soul, as Matthew says. But what Mark does is Mark goes back a verse in Deuteronomy chapter 6. He doesn't quote verse 5 first. He quotes verse 4. And I think it's very significant because when he looks back to Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verse 4, he says, God is Lord. Now, I left the word one out. I realize that because the truth is that when you say that God is Lord, then you understand He's one Lord. That is an adjective that describes the noun. But He is our Lord. What does that mean? Well, the reason I think this passage is interesting is because He says the Lord our God is one Lord. That's how Jesus began this answer. Most often we don't read that because we're reading Matthew and we're reading Luke and He doesn't include those words. But Mark backs up a verse and he says, that God is one Lord. Now, you know, it's interesting to notice in other religions how that, as we sometimes talk about compartmentalized religion, you do have compartmentalized religion. You have regulations in various areas, and God's interested in that and not in others. But if you look at the New Testament and you think about your obligation to God, He makes it clear. I mean, you can read, for example, in Colossians 4, in Colossians 3, and you're talking about, I don't care if you're talking about at home, at school, at work, and you look even to Romans 13 and the government that rules over you. Wherever you're at, you're a Christian. And as Peter stated, when questioned about his teaching of Christ to the Sanhedrin Council, we ought to obey God rather than men. There has to be somebody that is the supreme ruler. In fact, some countries actually call their rulers the supreme ruler, to make that clear. That at the top of the heap, there's one ruler. And His word is what matters. And that's why He says to love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy mind, with all thy soul, with strength, which is the first commandment, because He's your Lord. He's the one that governs every activity of your life. And unless you understand that, you won't obey any of the commandments. You won't obey any commandment unless you first understand that God is Lord. Let me ask you something. You ever had, particularly when you were a young person, you were in school, someone come up and tell you to do something, and you'd say, "You're not my daddy." In other words, I'm not listening to you. I don't have any obligation to you. It's kind of what it instructs us here. There's one person whose voice matters most, and that's God. So whatever everybody else might say to you, you can kind of take with a grain of salt. But what God says to you, He's Lord. It's binding. There's no question. There are no loopholes. There's no way to get around it. And that's something that I think is very important. Now, second thing is this. You know, when Jesus was having the conversation with Nicodemus, we talked about it a little bit in class this morning. When He was having the conversation with Nicodemus, he made a statement about God in verse 3. And what He said was, He said, God is true. No, verse 33, I'm sorry. Verse 3 is talking about the other. Verse 33. He said, He that receiveth His testimony, talking about God, has set this to His seal, that God is true. Now, just stop and think about it. If you have in your possession a bill of any kind, any denomination, whether it's a one up to I think they make a $10 million bill, I think. Not sure, never seen one. But whatever the denomination is, there's something that will be true about it. It has made into the paperwork something that sometimes referred to as a watermark, and now we have higher technical advantages than that. But that's the difference between a counterfeit and a real bill, is that. In days when things weren't quite so sophisticated, they actually, when papers were actually delivered, they had a real seal on them, a wax seal, and that made it official, stamped with the official that was sending it. So what he's saying in this passage is, He that receiveth His testimony, and this is John the Baptist, by the way, speaking, and he's talking about Christ. He was coming after Him. And he said, He that receiveth His testimony has set this to His seal, that God is true. If you believe Jesus to be the Messiah and to be the one that God has promised to come, then set this to seal, that God is true. That is the truth. And there is simply no way that we are going to be able to get around that. Now, it's kind of interesting. We've been studying in the book of 1 Corinthians on Sunday morning. We've begun that study. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, in verse 18, this statement is repeated. For the preaching of the cross is to them that perish foolishness, but unto us which are saved is the power of God. And I'm reading the wrong passage, by the way. I can't read my own writing. It's 2 Corinthians, not 1. In 2 Corinthians 1, we were studying in 1 Corinthians, but in 2 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 18, he said, But as God is true, our word toward you was not yea and nay. Have you ever stopped and think about what that said? You ever listen to a person and you believe most of what he said, but not all of it? I mean, you just didn't believe it all. They were part of it, and you said, well, I'm going to take that advice because I believe it, but the rest of it, I don't believe that to be true. What Paul is saying is, when it comes to God, that's not the way it is. You can mark it down that if God said it, it's true. It's kind of like, I think some back to this example I've used so many times in Psalms 8, where the old sea captain was sitting around and he was injured and his son was reading to him, and he read Psalms 8 that talks about whatsoever passeth through the paths of the sea. And he got to thinking, and he said to his son, if God said there are paths in the sea, then there are paths in the sea. And he began to research, and he was really the originator of modern shipping lanes because he figured them out. He figured out what the paths of the sea are. There is a path of the sea in the North Atlantic and the South Atlantic, and I would suppose in every other ocean in the world. Those two I'm pretty familiar with, what we call the Gulf Stream. One goes east, one goes west, and it's kind of interesting. We use those. But what's the point? That's a natural realm. That's really inconsequential almost. But what it says is, and his faith dictated, this gentleman's faith dictated what Paul said, if God said it, they're not true and false within it. Now, if I write something, there might be things that are not true. That's very likely. Because I may write about something and my knowledge is limited, and I may state something that's not true because I don't know any better. It could be that I'm just a bald-faced liar, and I write things that are not true because I want to prove a point, and it seems like a handy thing to do. That could happen. But with God, it's just not so. With God, everything that you see that is written is true. That's very important. Very important. You know, we have some notable people now who are in prison because they were dealing with very wealthy people and changed them from very wealthy people to poor people because they told them lies and embezzled their money. So we understand how valuable truth is. Truth is a valuable, valuable commodity. And God is true. But I'll tell you something else that's important to think about. And that's God is able. Now you think about that. Have you ever thought about one of the most common expressions when things go wrong in life, made by so many people? Everything's going to be all right. You ever think about that? Everything's going to be all right. When everything's set in stone, do you think everything was all right? God didn't ever tell you everything's going to be all right in the sense that those specific incidences would be taken care of. When you look back and you think about what he said in Romans chapter 11, what he's saying is if God says something to you through his inspired word, he's able. I mean, you know, parents will sometimes say, oh, Daddy will take care of that. Well, Daddy might not be able to take care of that. He doesn't have the ability. But with God, he does. It's interesting what's said here. Paul is talking to the Jews and the Gentiles, and specifically to the Jews here, who had lost their standing as the people of God because of their unfaithfulness and refusal to accept the Messiah who came. And so he's talking about them, and they're out here in a lost condition. And he said, they also, if they abide not still in unbelief, that is, if they will shift and change and accept Jesus as the Son of God, they'll be grafted in. Now, God cut them off, but he's able to graft them back in. For God is able to graft them in again, is the way he expresses that thought. Think about that. If you read something in the inspired text that God promises, He's able to deliver it. And it's important. If you get ready to buy in our country a mutual fund, you get a prospectus, and it will always say that the future gains may not be reflected by past history, because they know that they're not able to make promises. If somebody comes to your house and says, I promise this mutual fund will always earn 25% a year, then I tell you something, go look somewhere else. But when a client comes and says, we'll do the best we can, and we'll try to make decisions that will help you, that's true. But when God comes and says, this is the way it is, He's able to deliver that. We even sing a song. Think about that song we sing. He is able to deliver thee. Just think of how important that is. In chapter 4 and verse 4, Paul is talking here about this question of eating meat offered to idols. And he asks the question, who art thou that judgest another man's servant? To his own master he standeth or falleth. Yea, he shall be holden up. For God is able to make him stand. God is able. In 2 Corinthians chapter 9 and verse 8, the expression is actually used in referring to the contribution. And he's telling us to give as we've been prospered, as we purpose in our heart, not grudging necessity, God loveth the careful giver. And the next words out of his mouth are, or off his pen, and God is able to make all grace abound toward you. You know, if you stop and you go back and you look, maybe one of the best illustrations of that you could ever imagine would be in the book of Job. God in a single day stripped him of all his wealth, 100% pretty much. A whole lot more than that. Lost his children too, and his wife's devotion. But at the end of it, what did he do? He gave it back to him. He's able. He has the ability. Will he always? Well, that's not necessarily so in material things, but will he in spiritual things? Sure. We talked about this morning. There's a distinction in the natural and the spiritual realm. I mean, if you don't understand that, you can go back and look at the rich man and Lazarus, and you understand who was wealthy. The beggar. He was wealthy, not the rich man. Where did he end up? What did he end up with? So you stop and you think. God is able. And that is such a tremendous thing, because in the area of faith, when we're depending upon God for our salvation, we have to have that confidence that He is able. Now, there's another word that's used. God is faithful. Well, we use this word a lot, this word faithful, in the world. It's interesting to me that people just hoorah the idea of faith all the time. You ever read a contract? I mean, just actually read it. Read the contracts you sign. You ever notice how often they use an expression there of good faith? That means you're promising to be faithful to the promise that you made. That's what you're doing. I mean, people don't realize it. They think, faith, there's nothing to faith. But every contract, I suppose, that you sign, at least in the United States, will have some derivative of the phrase good faith in it, almost every time. Want people who are faithful, who are going to do what they say. In 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 9, it says, God is faithful, by whom you were called, under the fellowship of His Son, Jesus Christ our Lord. God is faithful. He said that in relation to the statement, He'll confirm you unto the end, that you may be blameless in the day of our Lord Jesus Christ. And God is faithful. What is the word that we use to describe a person who has committed adultery? They are unfaithful. They did not keep their word. What you're saying by saying this person was unfaithful, you're saying back in the day that they were married, they promised, I will keep myself and forsake all others. They didn't do it. They were not faithful. That's another way of saying they were liars. And that's really what he's saying in that particular passage. God is not a liar. You can absolutely depend upon what God said. In chapter 10 and verse 13, in talking about temptation, he said the same thing. There had no temptation taken you but such as is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not suffer you to be tempted above that you're able, but with every temptation also make a way to escape that you may be able to bear it. When a person said, I couldn't help it, he's wrong. I mean, I know it's a convenient excuse to say I couldn't help it. Couldn't help myself. Well, God provided the means. What you really need to say is I didn't take the opportunity that God gave me, because that's the truth. Now, if you believe that God is faithful and He provides a means of escape from every temptation, then you would believe that you have personal responsibility, that you are responsible for what you do. And that's very important in the spiritual realm, that we have that understanding. It's also interesting to notice back in chapter 10 and verse 34. I tried to include this into the statement. Then I thought, well, that won't be true to what I said. God in one word, because there's not one word here. There's really a phrase. Started to change the title of the lesson, didn't do that. But it says this. Peter opened his mouth and said, of the truth I perceive that God is no respecter of persons. That means He's faithful. You know, I hear people always talk about we have a two-tier justice system in our country. Well, the truth is, probably we always have to a certain degree. I mean, if you have enough money, sometimes you can avoid something that folks who are poor can't. That may be so. But I'm going to tell you one thing that we need to understand. God is no respecter of persons. When I was a boy, fixing tickets was a very common practice. People would get a speeding ticket. I had a friend. And it got to the point where the authorities in Murray County wouldn't even give him a ticket because it wasn't worth the bother. Because every time he got a ticket, Dad just called the judge and throw it out. He'd just tear it up and throw it away. Well, let me tell you something. God's not a respecter of persons. He doesn't care who you are. He doesn't care what your position is. He don't care how wealthy you are. He doesn't care what your educational level is. None of those things matter. God's going to be faithful to His word to you no matter what. In every nation, he that feareth Him and worketh righteousness is accepted with Him. It's always amazed me to go to churches. The bigger the church is, the more it becomes apparent. To go to churches and look at the diversity of people from the very bottom of the social and economic scale to the very top, and there's no difference in it. A guy might stand up and lead a prayer. He's a garbage truck driver. Another guy might lead the closing prayer, and he's the bank president. But to God, it doesn't matter. He doesn't care. He's going to be faithful to you because He's faithful to Himself. And that's very important. You know, sometimes people don't realize that when a person, as they say, cheats on their wife, they're really being unfaithful to themselves. Because after all, when the two became one, then anything you do to one, you do to the other. And we need to realize that. We need to understand it. God is going to be faithful. And then there's a kind of a darker side a little bit. And I kind of found this amazing too when I turned over to Hebrews chapter 12. Now he does use an adjective here, but I eliminated the adjective because if you ever dissect the sentence, you realize that's really, you're looking at the primary focus is that noun. And he says in chapter 29, our God is a consuming fire. But the primary thing to remember is He is a fire. What's a fire do? What's a fire do? What's a fire used for? Well, fire is used to do one of two things. It can either purify something or it can destroy it. Our God's a consuming fire. He's not going to ignore our misbehavior. He's not going to turn it back and pretend it didn't happen. He will hold us accountable. Remember, He's not a respecter of persons. Remember, He's faithful. Those things all play a part in it. Remember, He's able. I mean, when Jesus was talking about eternity, He talked about you don't fear Him who can destroy the body, but you just fear Him who can destroy both soul and body in hell. Why? Because He's able to do it. Man can't. God can't. I mean, you just look back to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. And the old king had the ability to throw them in, but he didn't have the ability to burn them up. But God doesn't. And so He's telling you that we need to fear God because we need to understand that He's going to hold us accountable in the judgment day, and there's going to be He's going to look at the decision that we've made. And if we make the wrong decision, He uses the expression, our God is a fire, but He intensifies it by saying a consuming fire. In this case, He's talking about punishment, without doubt. Consuming has to do with destroying, bringing to nothing. And then we look at this idea. God is light. That's an interesting thought, too. We've been talking about this morning and last week as well, the revelation of God's will. You do understand that the things that are revealed within God's will, you don't know outside of God's will. You don't know you have a spiritual side if God didn't reveal it. You don't know that. There's some evidences of it. When you look at animals, we can't even look at you being different, but without God saying you were created in His image, you don't really know that. When you think of light, just think of this expression sometimes we use when we say, well, let me shed some light on the situation. So in 1 John 1 and verse 5, when he said this then is the message which we have heard of Him and declare to you, that God is light, and in Him is no darkness at all. We even have a song that talks about wandering in darkness. What it's talking about is we ignore God. We don't have any spiritual light. We don't know where we're going. You ever walk through the woods at night? I mean when it's dark. I don't mean when it's kind of light. I mean dark. In my younger years, when I did do a little hunting, and don't anymore, but I did, it's kind of always advantageous to get into the woods and be there before daylight, and you didn't really want to use a flashlight because that kind of told everything you were there. So you walk in the woods, and you ever feel a limb hit you in the head when it didn't? Because you're walking along like, it's going to hit me in the head. It's a bad feeling. Well, the truth is that God sheds light. And you know how interesting it is if you ever been there and you're kind of uncertain, then all of a sudden the sun comes up and you kind of just feel a sense of comfort come over you to realize how much easier it is in the light. That's what He's expressing about God. We walk in darkness until we accept God as a reality and His will as the means of being acquainted with Him. And then the last point is made also in this same book. God is love. You know, I've watched this commercial many times for the Shriners Hospital, and they'll talk about what love is. And love is a new artificial limb or whatever it is. But they're really right. They're really right. Because love is really the expressing of that emotion by deeds that are done. That's what love is. Love is demonstrated by what we do. God so loved the world, He gave His only begotten Son. Think about it. When you say that God is love, how do you know that? He gave His Son to die for you. We have soldiers, many of them over the years. I don't know the exact number. The only exact number I remember was Vietnam. I don't know the exact number of that. It was 58,000. I remember that because of the bombing. Who didn't come back from that war. Would you say those people love their country? Well, sure. They put the ultimate sacrifice. So you think about it, and you say, God is love. And remember that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So actually, God went to that cross to die for you in the form of His Son. So you look at this passage in verse 8. He that loveth not knoweth not God, for God is love. He also expands that in verse 11 by saying, Beloved, if God so loved us, we ought also to love one another. Interesting. Verse 16, and we know and we have known and believed the love that God has shown to us. God is love, and that he that dwelleth in love dwelleth in God, and God in him. Some interesting words. I thought when we're saying God in a word, just look back to all those words and think for a moment. You know, every situation that you're in life demands something different. It demands different things out there. But remember that this God that we serve, according to what's stated in 1 Timothy 3, has given us all things that pertain to life and godliness. So, he uses these different words to talk about different needs that we have and how significant they are. We're going to sing a song of encouragement. We've talked about the first principles of the gospel as we preached this morning. You need to repent and be baptized for the remission of sins. You need to do that. Why? So that you can accept God as your Lord. You know, I say accept Him for a reason. You know, God's your Lord anyway. I don't care whether you obey the gospel or not. He's still your Lord. Whether you acknowledge Him has nothing to do with whether He is. I mean, that's just pretty obvious. We can say whatever we wish, but we are responsible to God. Think about that as together we stand as we sing.